Hey guys, so today I'm going to be talking about Norman Mailer's World War II novel, The Naked and the Dead. It was kind of a cultural, uh, not a cultural reset. It was a cultural, definitely a cultural something when it came out because it came out in like 48 or 49, right after the war. And I know it got a lot of notoriety at the time. Norman Mailer wrote a few other, well, he wrote a lot of other books after that. That was his first one, and I know it was a big hit for him when it first came out. Um, I guess you could say it's sort of postmodern. Not really. It's more of it's got a lot of class jargon in it. Like it talks a lot about um, the class division and um, structure and stuff like that within the armed forces, which makes it interesting, but also makes it really tedious. Also, um, the plot's not so significant as to really drive you home with it. You just have to be really interested in World War II, I guess, history, and like interested in the fact that this novel was very important when it came out because it did capture a lot of people's feelings at the time, especially after having a lot, like way more young men joining the military than ever would normally have. I think that's why it really struck home because um, Norman Mailer, who was drafted at the time and in like 44, 45, still landed in the Pacific somewhere, and was kind of in the ranks. I think he was in the ranks. He might have been an officer, but anyways, it for that alone, it's interesting and it's worth the read probably. But I will be honest, it's a lot. It's kind of tedious, but the style itself is fine. The style itself is actually really well. Kind of well done. It's sort of cinematic at the beginning, and then it kind of draws you into a lot of different characters. The hardest thing I think is just keeping up with how many freaking characters there are. That's the problem with I think a lot of war novels is you kind of have too much focus on everybody. Um, Maybe too much. Maybe it's appropriate because it's supposed to be about large groups of guys. And if you've ever been in the military, been in an organization like the military that has a lot of dudes working together, it captures that pretty well. It's actually pretty surprising. One of the surprising things about the novel, knowing that it did come out in '48, so it's contemporary, and it came out, or it was the author was actually in the conflict. It's interesting how little has changed. If you read it, that's I think the first thing you'll notice is that very little changes about the way that people work together in situations like that. And in situations like that, I don't even mean war. I really just mean in situations where you have authority that you have to deal with on a constant daily day-to-day basis, and you have varied uh, responses to that authority because you have people who are just um, stick in the muds about it, even though they know they can't change it by acting upset all the time. And you also have people who are uh, way too all about it. Gung ho is what they say in the Marines. This is actually it's interesting because this is the Pacific, but it's the Army in the Pacific, which I guess is where he was. And I forget that the Pacific wasn't just fought by Marines, but of course this book, anyways. But that's the main draw for me. I think in reading this is the accuracy of portraying those relationships when it comes to authority, not only on the small scale, which is what you usually deal with in those, your day to day is the sergeants and the corporals, basically, and then most of the guys being private or lance corporal. I don't know what lance corporal is in the Army, but whatever that is. Lower ranks to the like very immediately higher, but just barely higher than you, and then like having to deal with that authority. Um, it's complicated to kind of capture that in a interesting way and in a way that stays true to how it is without just using that to draw a plot. And because there's not a crazy amount of plot in the book, he's got all the room in the world just to talk about those relationships within armed forces culture. So that's the great part of that book. What makes it more interesting still, and what it makes it more of a cultural study is the focus on the officers, because there's several different plots going on all the time, but one of the major plots is a lower ranking officer and the general who's in charge of the entire invasion of the made up island. What's interesting about that is that you have a very liberal, kind of wannabe communist, but really just kind of a milquetoast liberal lieutenant, and the general who is a very, if this makes sense, class conscious reactionary who's very conscious. That's the arbitrary part, or that is the most contrived part of the book, I think, is that the general is extremely class conscious but also very reactionary, or that he's very reactionary but also very class conscious. But when that character also is pretty well fleshed out, though. I don't want to dismiss that as a completely contrived bad guy, because he actually isn't portrayed as just this monster. And honestly, it's hard not to root for him because the lieutenant is a whiny baby most of the time. And I think that Norman Mailer was very self-conscious when he wrote about that, because I feel like that was kind of what he understood himself to be. Being a New Yorker and academic and already trying to write all the time before he went into the armed forces, I think he understood how to poke fun at himself. So it's hard to say that he was trying to make a gotcha novel when he wrote this and say all the generals are evil morons, but I was good, because he doesn't do that. He actually is pretty, again, really varied in the way that he approaches different people from all these crazy different backgrounds. And that the balance, it's hard to have any balance with that, but he does achieve somewhat of a balance between the different plots and between the different character descriptions and interactions, because most of the character description is going to be in the interactions in any sort of a good writing. And this was really good writing because the characters develop through the interactions. As we see in real life, that's just how people are. You find out about people by their interactions with you and other people. Moving on from that, to focus again about the class critiques and stuff like that. What was really interesting about this book in particular, and what kind of draws it somewhat into the discussion about Nietzsche that was going on recently over at Trey's channel, Telosbound, which this channel is in association with. He was talking about Nietzsche, I know, about a month ago or so. Maybe it was even longer ago than that. It's been a fast summer. But the discussions about resentment and how it creates better soldiers, better fighting men, was really interesting. Towards the middle part of the first half of the novel, there's a lot of great discussion between that lieutenant character I was talking about and the general, and the attitude of the general towards the enlisted men isn't so much hateful, but it is realistic. And that sort of drew up a very interesting perspective from Norman Mailer, who I'm pretty sure was definitely somehow left-wing. He was kind of a, not hippie, I don't remember what you called it back, beatnik, I guess, beat generation. He was somewhat like that. I'm pretty sure he was friends with Jack Kerouac. And so he had a lot of critiques of society, but I think he was very realistic when he pointed out that this general person really was being a realist, or is being a realist in that story, when he points out the need for officers to resent the enlisted and enlisted to resent the officers. That's how war works. And that's why you can't have a class-conscious war, and you can't have, and this is talking from within the perspective of communism or whatever, like Leninism, I guess. I know Lenin pointed this out. You can't have class warfare or a warfare that frees up the working class if it's an actual nation-on-nation war. And so the general does a really good job of pointing it out to the lieutenant that even though he thinks he's on the right side of history by fighting in the war, he's like, de facto, you are not helping anything, and you're very liberal for thinking that you are helping anything just by participating in the war. And in fact, war only accentuates, aggravates, determines, but also solidifies class distinction. And that was something I didn't ever think about until reading this book, about how it always solidifies people's place in society and makes them more aligned to it, more aggressively part of that class distinction, whether it's, whether they're petty bourgeoisie is the word for it. I think like middle class or upper middle class, or whether they're lower class, or if they know they're in sort of a ruling class or in sort of a landowning position, it's going to accentuate those differences, and it's going to bring people back to the fighting force, more or less accustomed to that, and more or less adapted to it to an extreme degree that makes them incapable of thinking about it to any other degree, and it just buries the resentment. Basically, is what what fighting with other people does, and knowing that there's somebody up top who is deciding we're going to charge this way or we're going to advance this way, knowing we will get cut down or whatever. Knowing that deepens the resentment, but because of the situation and the life or death situation involved, fighting under those conditions makes it so that that class conscious resentment is buried and solidified and forgotten, but not in a way that makes it not in a way that makes it go away, but in a way that makes it solidified. And so I guess that's where it kind of goes back to Nietzsche, because I know Nietzsche talks a lot about forgetfulness and how forgetfulness makes it possible for us to move on as creatures, as human beings. Like, we move forward by forgetting about things, by allowing those things to be in the past and allowing those painful things to go away and be there forever. And so what combat, at least from Norman Mailer's perspective, is doing, or from his character, the general character in his novel, that perspective, what it's doing is it's making it possible for working class people to bury the resentment in the forgetfulness of something like war, which you force yourself to forget already, forcing yourself also to forget that resentment, or bury that resentment and bury that sort of class on class hatred, and making it possible to, making it easier to move past that when you get home and when you're back in the workforce and when you're back under those similar conditions, just in a less heightened life or death scenario. I don't know if any of that really made a whole lot of sense. I know it made sense to me when I was reading it, and if it got lost, me taking it from the book to this video, let me know in the comments, and we'll try to parcel it out together, because that was a lot. But anyways, Norman Mailer, he's a good author. He's a good writer. This might be a lot to finish. There's parts of it that it just goes on. So if you don't finish it, do not feel bad. But yeah, definitely worth a look into, at least a quick scan. The combat, it's just funny because, it's a combat book. It's a book about World War II. The last thing interesting about it is any of the combat. The combat is as combat does, I guess, but what happens in and through that and the relationships that form out of it are where the real meat of it is. And I think if you're looking for some really realistic writing about, again, those specific scenarios, and if you found yourself in those scenarios before, you're going to identify with this kind of writing of these different characters. You're going to identify with one or two of them, and you're going to hate all the other ones, because just like you hated them when you knew them. Because it's like, man, it's an unbreakable circle, man. Like the way that people work together in these situations. Anyways, you guys have a good Saturday. I'm glad we get to talk about this book. Again, let me know in the comments if you got any other questions or suggestions for other books to peek into. You guys have a great rest of your day.